Benning here to give you a preview of this weekend's matchup against UCLA, coming off the close loss at Ohio State. Damon, I saw you briefly at halftime in Columbus. You were feeling pretty confident. How come?
Yeah, I just felt like I always feel better when I don't think a team can handle you up front. I just felt like Nebraska was going to be able to stay in that game because Ohio State was going to have a hard time blocking them. And without the versatility of run and pass for Ohio State, I thought even those talented guys could struggle a little bit.
Yeah, and someone we haven't talked about in a little while is Jamari Butler, and I know it's because he hasn't been fully healthy, but between him and MJ Sherman, they had quite the game, and I feel like that was the difference maker on defense. What did you see from them, too, that stood out?
Yeah, they were relentless, and I think, it's interesting. When the secondary doesn't play well, it's very easy to see, and we say, the secondary needs to do this or that, but quietly, a key to this defense is when those jacks play well. When those outside guys are active and they force you to account for them, it's amazing how it frees up the interior guys and guys can run. So I just think they were relentless. They were equally as good against the run as they were against the pass rush. And, I think it helps. I mean, even Ohio State has some issues with depth, and I think they attacked some spots that were very vulnerable along the offensive line, and those guys just got busy.
Yeah.
Butler in particular, he is I get the whole crush thing I have on him, but just his mentality. He was dialed in before game, so it was cool to see how it
translated.
Yeah, translated in game.
Yeah. Well, between the Indiana and the Ohio State game, I heard Isaac Gifford say he was frustrated on defense because there was too much solo tackling going on. He's like, there's just not the identity that we play with. We rush the football as a unit. It felt like that shifted from Indiana to Ohio State. What else did you see that was fixed in that quick week turnaround?
Yeah, so I really like the simplicity of it. There were a few little nuances with coverage, like when to play cover 3, when to play cover 2. But for the most part, they got into their fronts and their fits, and they allowed them to play a little freer and a little faster. Going back just a smidge, I think it started in practice. I heard from a lot of the guys. It was fun. It was fast. We were playing free. It wasn't as tight. It was a little loosey-goosey where guys were, their personality and the tempo could come out. Because if you feel free, you can play fast. When you kind of feel these constraints of the weight of the outcome on you, it can slow you down a little bit. And I think getting back to that style in practice where it is that high speed, those collisions and game plans are tightened up, I think they're the beneficiary of that.
Yeah, and to limit Ohio State to only 64 yards rushing, did you expect that going into the game?
I didn't, and that was the key. One of the keys that we talked about. I said you can't take away it all, but start with trying to take away the run game. I didn't see 64 yards worth of net yards in terms of taking away the ground game, just because they had rammed the ball on just about everybody. And they just couldn't block Nebraska one-on-one, and so. That was very, very impressive. And they were able to have a ton of havoc plays and sacks, too. And Ohio State is the best in the conference in terms of not having their quarterback be pressured. So it's a really good defensive effort from Nebraska.
On Nebraska's side for rushing, 120 yards rushing for Nebraska. There was about 3 to 4 moments in the second half where it felt like you make one guy miss, you break a shoestring tackle. Yeah. The game looks a little bit different. But what part about what you saw from Dante and Emmett and that back and forth run game in the second half that maybe showed some positive improvement?
Yeah, so I think I can kind of get a good feel of when I feel like defensive backs are looking through potential tacklers versus focused on them. I always learn to kind of see the big space behind, not the small little objects in the way. And it just kind of helps you zero in on what I would call running to daylight. And I think that's a lot of what those guys were doing. And there were a couple times during the broadcast I just kind of chuckled to myself. I'm like, oh, shoot, you let him get to your legs in the open field where I mean, those kinds of things will happen from time to time, but I felt like from a schematic standpoint and how those guys were aggressive in terms of attacking the hole, it was a pretty good compliment.
Yeah, and I heard you talk about this during the broadcast. You've been to Ohio State multiple times. You mentioned the atmosphere in there. It was my first time, and it didn't feel as daunting as I thought. Yeah. A lot of tradition like Memorial, but maybe not
especially like when you first get there and it's empty and it's majestic. It's kind of these hallowed grounds.
Yes.
Something was going on.
Yeah.
It was late arriving, number one.
I wanted you to touch on the atmosphere, like how it felt different this time, because I don't know any different.
It was late
arriving.
And Nebraska got hammered the last time that I was up there, and it was very kind of front-runner-ish, where it was kind of in your face and catty, and it was not a nice place to be. But this time, between the Boo Birds and folks leaving, I was a little taken aback. It really didn't get loud, what I would call loud, until about 4 or 5 minutes to go in that game. Right? And I'm like, where has this been?
Yeah.
Right? But, I mean, I get it. You win so many games, and you get accustomed to doing things a certain way. You kind of lose the reality of the moment. But I was a little taken aback at how subdued it was.
Yeah, well, we move into UCLA, but they're coming off a loss at number 4 in the country. And then we've heard the coaches say this week, now that's the expectation. The standard's always been there, but it seems like the standard's been pushed a bit. So now that Nebraska's proved it to themselves, maybe not even just like saying it out loud, hey, I think we can hang with the big dogs. We showed it to ourselves that we can. How much pressure or confidence is added to this UCLA game for not to replicate last Saturday, but to know, is this our identity?
I think it's they're confident. And I think sometimes we talk about the process and then the outcome. Well, the outcome, the desired outcome is still always to win. So I don't want to confuse that. But on a smaller scale, the scope was, hey, let's line up. Let's give them what we got and let the chips fall where they may. If you're talking about that incremental accomplishment, they did that.
Yeah.
And they did it based on preparation. Hey, let's just shoot our shot, see what happens. Shoot our shot again, let's see what happens. Let's see if we can't get this thing into the fourth quarter. All the little pit stops, the little bullet points that you're trying to hit along the way to get the desired outcome, they achieved. So you convinced yourself, you know what, if we put in the time, the effort, and the work, we can put ourselves in position to win games. It doesn't matter who it's against. Let's try that this week too. Let's try to replicate our work output, how we attack things, how we hit, our iPads when we're looking for plays to study. If I can replicate that and put myself in a position to have some success, I can play with confidence. And when I play with confidence, sky's the limit.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about UCLA now because that's who comes to town in Nebraska, where we turn a memorial for about the first time in a month. We've already heard coaches and players say they're not playing their record. And I want to explain maybe why, to remind everyone. So they are coming off their first conference win this season, but the players on Nebraska were the first to tell you that UCLA's record has been challenging. So that's why they can't play this record. They go to Hawaii, then they come home and they play a red-hot Indiana in week 2. They go to Baton Rouge to face LSU. Then they go back to UCLA to play Oregon. Then they follow that up by Penn State and Minnesota, and then they go 3,000 miles across the country and play Rutgers to get their first win. I heard you say earlier their trajectory is climbing. Yeah. Why do you say that?
Yes, because I think they're playing much better than their record. Nebraska, people talk about how now all of a sudden it's like the 11th toughest strength of schedule. Well, you know who's 4th? That'd be UCLA. So they have played a very difficult schedule, and they're a perfect case study the other way of process versus outcome. With Coach Foster, he's very regimented and he demands a lot, and he runs a pretty tight ship. So you want to see that play out over time where discipline can win. And so they got off to a little bit of a slow start, but what they've been able to do is hang in there and stay the course. They're playing good competitive football. It was a 2-score game with Indiana, with less than a minute to go in the third quarter. You played Rutgers on the road and came out of there with a victory. And in between there was like this incremental climb of physicality. They don't have the depth that some other teams in the conference have, but they're very stout up front along that D-line, and they'll hit you in the secondary. And so as their defense has kind of come around and added some physicality, it's allowed this offense a chance to kind of evolve. They can't really run the ball really well right now. Yeah. So what they've done is kind of an offset is they've gone to that quick passing game outside the numbers is kind of an extension of the run game because they throw it to their backs, the tandem, quite a bit.
Yeah. So I want to give you a quick stat comparison because you mentioned that UCLA's defense has added some physicality, but when you look at the numbers, it shows some just differences when you look at Nebraska, that's their strength, but 23 sacks on 469 tackles. UCLA has 10 sacks on 403 total tackles. I know the last few weeks, the offensive game plan for Nebraska has been maybe dictated by the pressures they're going to see. With the pressure maybe not as being in Ohio State or in Indiana, does that open the playbook a bit for Satterfield and Dillon?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think you're going to have a little versatility. This isn't going to be one of those deals where I think they're going to line up and just be able to run the football. And Monangai had some success. I think he was 23 or 24 for like 119. That's pretty workmanlike. So it was a little feast or famine there. They didn't really allow Cali McManus to get going. Not that that's going to be a strength of Dillon's anyway, but I think for Nebraska, creativity, and maybe if I'm Nebraska, I would work backwards, kind of like pitching backwards in counts to good hitters. I would maybe start to try to throw the ball on first down a little bit more vertically to open up the run game, because I think if UCLA is watching Nebraska and Ohio State, they see that Nebraska had some success in some of their spread sets, like those 3-by-1s, and they could control numbers in the box. Nebraska may get to that, but they may have to throw it first.
Yeah. Before I get to your keys, I want to bring up what Ty Robinson said this week. He already drew the parallel for this game being a comparison to last year's Michigan State. How much do you think that's being talked about inside the locker room, just because the veteran guys know what that feels like, but maybe not so much the new guys?
Yeah, so there's going to be that balance, and I think that's where you have to more lead by example. If you don't want to feel like that again when you headed to East Lansing and came home with that disappointing L, which, in my opinion, was one of the lower moments in last season, then you have to prepare in such a way where you're telling the youngsters, you know what, we're going to try to avoid that. This is how we have to prepare. This is how we didn't prepare before. And the young guys, they don't know any better, right? They just got to hop on board. Not everybody can be a good leader. Sometimes you have to be a good follower. So I think what Ty Robinson is saying, it's not more than words. It's how are they actually physically preparing for this one.
Well, with the new Big Ten opponent coming to town, what are the 3 keys for Nebraska?
So I think that, number one, they got to tackle in space. There'll be lots of opportunities out in space. I think there's 30-some catches between the running backs from UCLA, and they get it out on the perimeter. So you got to get guys to the ground in open areas. You may not have as many opportunities to gang tackle and get multiple helmets to the ball, so get guys to the ground when you get the opportunity. Number 2 is get UCLA off the field on third down. Third down is going to be a thing in this whole deal because they give up 57% of third downs on defense, which is woeful. So convert third downs, and then when Nebraska's on defense, get UCLA off the field on third down and keep the snap count down.
Yeah, well, there you have it. We will see what happens this weekend when UCLA comes to Nebraska for the first time as a Big Ten opponent.